Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to our 17th session of Islamic Book Reviews with myself, al-Azami, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Matthew Hedges, someone whose work I've followed for many years at this point. And it's not just your academic work, of course, that I've followed for many years. And here to talk about your book, recent, hot off the press, Reinventing the Sheikhdom, Clan, Power and Patronage in Mohammed bin Zayed's UAE. So I'm really looking forward to this sort of hour and a half or so session. And just a brief introduction to Matthew before we move on to his discussion. So Matthew's an academic focusing on authoritarian regimes with an emphasis on the monarchies of the Arabian Peninsula. And this is particularly interesting to me because actually my next project, I'm really looking forward to studying Islamic authoritarianism, as I'm calling it, in inverted commas. You're currently you got your PhD. This was your PhD at the University of Durham, and you're currently at Exeter, which is one of these other fantastic centres for Middle Eastern studies actually in the country. So it really gives me great pleasure to welcome you. And in keeping with the standard format, we'll be handing over to Matthew in a moment to speak about his book and giving us an overview of the project for about 10 minutes, or take as long as you like. And then we'll shift to a discussion, perhaps for about half an hour to 40 minutes. And I would welcome people to write down their questions, but from around maybe 45, 50-minute mark, we'll start sort of addressing those. I can see that some comments are already coming in. One of our regular viewers with the screen name Black Viper says Assalamu alaikum wa alaikum salam. So we look forward to your engagement. Please don't hesitate to write in your comments and questions midstream, but we'll come to them a bit later. But without further ado, Matthew, it's a pleasure to have you here. Please take it away and introduce your book.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning, and thank you very much to everyone tuning in. So my book and my PhD at the University of Durham examined the methods and means by which authoritarian states seek to maintain their power. The principal question was the UAE's post-Arab Spring regime security strategy. And when looking at the state, there's an acknowledgement that it's a federal entity. There are 7 different political entities within one overarching state structure. The difference between the state, the nation, and the regime all have different objectives, different concerns, and different processes by which they interact with each other element. This is further underpinned really by the idea that the state, its principal concern and its principal threat perception is actually from internal sources. It therefore has to actually seek ways and means by which it can maximize its authority either directly or through indirect means. This theoretically, it plays upon the insecurity dilemma, which states that the predominant threats are from internal sources, and every action taken to protect against this is actually further destabilizing their position. I created a novel framework by which I defined what regime security is. This is called the neo-corporate Praetorianism. And it's basically anchored by 5 different pillars. Each of these are used as a way to maintain and enforce the power of the state. Firstly, there's the military, or the UAE, in this case, the UAE Armed Forces. Secondly, it's the role that surveillance plays within the state. And this can come through very direct means, through to quite unobtrusive mechanisms and strategies which the layman may not actually physically see on a day-to-day basis. I then examined the degrees of strategic economic control. And then lastly, I looked at industrial development. My model, the neo-corporate Praetorianism model, however, also provides an avenue for what initially has been termed the religious establishment, but actually later can be applied to other case studies and is framed as the ideological establishment. It's that in quite a looking at it from a certain perspective, is that the power of ideology, be it religious doctrine or political support and dogma, this can be used to legitimize and to give authority to certain figures, or to try and reinterpret certain social facts. This is the PhD. I've made reference to it in the book at the very start, and something which has obviously deeply affected me during my time undertaking research was the idea of dealing with facts and information. I was arrested and detained, sentenced to life imprisonment on the charge of spying on behalf of the UK government. I was later pardoned and released. And shortly after my release, the UAE released a new set of laws and legislation which sought to define and refine what they interpreted as confidential or sensitive information. I was initially charged with handling secretive information, but I made it very clear that everything in it was not secret, and in fact it was open source. Luckily, my publisher Hearst and Oxford University Press have been very kind in allowing me to keep all of the sources in the book, which from a publisher's standpoint, this is quite a boring topic, but it takes up pages, and more pages means more cost for the publisher. In my original PhD, there were over 1,000 footnotes, but it was crucial for me to ensure that there was thorough and accurate sourcing throughout. And so my thesis not only shows a new novel theoretical framework, it provides the contextual application of the UAE, which for several reasons is thoroughly and critically under-examined in the majority of academic disciplines, but also provides maybe a lessons learned approach, a retrospective analysis on what limitations exist when undertaking research in authoritarian states, perceived sensitivities and restrictions that this then has. It is quite a tightrope that many people maybe aren't sure about until really it's too late. I can provide some contextual examples. I can provide some evidence from the book, but I'm absolutely happy to engage this, and I'm very sorry for the technical issues.
No problem at all. I mean, please don't apologize. Don't worry about it at all, because this is the occupational hazard of working remotely, and it's something we've become thoroughly used to over the course of the past 2 years. Actually, I'm very grateful that we have these kinds of opportunities now to connect. We're in different parts of the country, and we're still being able to share with a relatively large audience, actually, our discussion, and we're getting questions already. So it's wonderful to have you, and really to sort of hear your sort of scholarship, but also hear your story, because it's so fascinating when our scholarship becomes intertwined with our personal lives in very striking ways and very problematic ways as well. I wanted to pick up on a number of features of what you were talking about, and perhaps I'll take the last thing first. And I'm going to home in on the religious question at some point, because this is very close to my own work. My publisher happens to be your publisher as well, and I've published around the same time as you a book on religious politics, including in the UAE after the Arab revolutions, and how religion is used as this very potent ideological tool to legitimate authoritarianism. And I hope to explore that in greater detail. I wanted to ask you about sort of the idea of your work, which is extremely, copiously documented. You have over 100 pages of notes in this book. And the difference between research in a free society and research in an authoritarian society, and what counts as intelligence, right? I mean, So you talk about also the intelligence mukhabarat complex and the various complex ways in which the UAE is one of the most surveilled societies in the world today. But why is it that you were seen as a threat in this way, and sort of stories concocted about you being, rather than an academic, someone akin to James Bond, so to speak? Whereas in our society, as you suggested, this would be seen as relatively boring stuff. So what is the difference between those two things? And I'd love to hear your reflections.
It's a tricky question to ask, because I don't know genuinely still how and why events unfolded the way they did.
Right.
There was quite a strict difference and change in engagement as soon as they had access to my phone, which included emails, documents, and so forth, including numerous drafts of my PhD.
Right.
The problem then comes, and I absolutely acknowledge the perceived sensitivity of the PhD. I do understand that.
Right.
But when it is seen in context of, as you said, the copious referencing and footnotes,
right,
and when asked about sources and where this information comes from, if there is no understanding that this is public information and that it is sourced from say, the official news agency,
right,
it says more about the environment by which those persons, those interests, that state security, the mukhabarat, the way they work whilst it's a punitive organization primarily, they are also actually detached from society that they're trying to protect.
Right.
They're such a credible and intrinsic part of the system. It's hard to see the wood from the trees. Understanding that this information is publicly available, it may carry the perceived strategic importance they believe,
right,
but that doesn't have to mean that it's secretive. And hence the foreword is an illustration of that they actually changed those laws to include, quote, news and information. And this is then not just relevant to someone such as myself, but to anyone engaging in research about the state. It then does become quite a minefield, because you would do so knowing that it may step on certain apprehensions and tensions within the state.
So news and information, this is on page 15 of your preface, news and information related to the armed forces, the Ministry of Interior and Security Services, as well as formation and other things. And then news and information and measures relating to adopted to detect crime, etc. So news is basically illegal about these sorts of things in the US, in the UAE Penal Code, Article 170. Is that?
That's what it says.
Yeah, yeah.
And that, I think that would be fine. And you can understand that if you have a certain Orientalist approach. Right. And I think this is the idea. There's a self-Orientalist type of approach where they're nearly adopting this perception that they are 100%. Right. The idea that we can't handle this information, and so we're going to close it off.
Right.
Yet on the other hand, and this is it's not just the UAE, it's in many countries, they'll try and show their modernity.
Right.
They will show that they're a forward-thinking, educational, forebearer. They will sponsor many different projects. They will get involved in different areas.
Right.
But the left hand doesn't speak to the right hand here.
Right.
They give completely conflicting evidence, and it doesn't seem to add up. It can maybe weaken their own argument in doing so.
So this is, in a sense, that what's embedded in that question is that in quote unquote free societies, I actually have a certain degree of reservation about that sort of a phrase, particularly in the context of the war on terror, because of course freedom is sort of like contingent on various things. But one of the fascinating things about countries like the UAE and a lot of these Gulf security states, Egypt is another example, is that they found the war on terror narrative extremely conducive to their authoritarianism. And so, setting aside the war on terror for a moment, in free societies we don't expect, heavily qualified, we don't expect that looking on, at public source material in a way that gives us a deeper understanding of the structure of the way we're governed is subversive per se, right? I mean, this is what Foucault and governmentality and all of this stuff has been doing to death for decades, right? But in these societies, this is an act of great subversion. So you're doing it, if you don't mind me sort of portraying this in such a way, and you can correct me if you think this is a misportrayal. You're going into this society with the mentality of a free society, thinking, look, this is all public domain knowledge. I'm going to engage with people in good faith. And the consequence of that is you're seen as a threat. And it's assumed that, you're obviously... These aren't things that we do in this society. People who ask these sorts of questions are basically subversive agents of foreign states. That's how you are portrayed. So, in a sense, you're saying, yes, these are modernizing states, but they're also states which are these paranoid, hyper-protective entities that are constantly concerned about their imminent collapse, so to speak.
It comes down to the absolute fragility of the perceived fragility of that state-society relationship.
Right.
And I explored this in that historical context. When you see the direction, the engagement of the founder, Sheikh Zayed, and the threats that he engaged with, how he managed them. But when you then take this and you expand it further into the modern day, where you're now dealing with citizens and non-citizens, residents, you're dealing with ideological threats, political threats, social threats. Everything is weaponized. And you can see this in their own discourse. When they approach a certain topic, that there's somewhat more autonomy than others. But any issue, because of the lack of... because of the perceived lack of public engagement with these issues, they're deemed to be even more fragile. Right. So we were speaking from your own background about that discussion, engagement with religious ideology.
Right.
That quietist approach, the authoritative direction would kind of seek, in a strange way, to separate the public from the private sphere.
Right.
However, at the same time, those private issues are part of the public sphere regardless. And they're kind of, at least in the UAE, it's hard to separate them. But, for example, modest clothing in a shopping mall, right. Or the idea of being able to serve alcohol, right. Or we've heard now of having a gambling resort in Ras Al Khaimah. Right. They are clear examples of that separation between the state and society, where one is kind of nearly brushed aside. There is no permissible area for discourse, because the ideology that supports the entire structure, it completely has disavowed that.
Right.
Those channels for upward discussion and dialogue, be it on issues of social issue through to security, are non-existent.
Right. So, I mean, these are and these are, of course, this is a trend that you find throughout that region, of course. So, Saudi Arabia is kind of a very obvious case where MBS is kind of particularly notorious for muzzling, and in one case, as far as we can tell, like ordering the assassination of a journalist in a third country. But even in the freer, sort of ostensibly freer states, like a place like Qatar, where they have Al Jazeera and so on, I mean, it's fascinating that Al Jazeera's focus is overwhelmingly in the international arena, very little focus on Qatar itself, and there will be red lines for talking about internal politics and so on. So yeah, I've noticed a number of people are putting in questions and comments, and we really appreciate them and we welcome them, and we're going to address them hopefully in about 20 minutes time, if that's all right. So please do keep them coming. I wanted to sort of ask you, so this is something which features in your book a good deal, the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings. So you spoke about the fragility of the state, or the perceived fragility very often. I mean, I actually take heart from the fact that they think that they're so sort of fragile, right? And to a large extent, this stuff is about confidence in an entity, because these are all, social constructs in many respects. That fragility was really, perceived in an acute sense after the Arab revolutions. And this is a thread that runs through your book. Do you want to speak for a moment about what they saw as a problem and the way in which they responded?
So, in an essence, when I put it back to the idea of needing to maintain and enforce power, this is further driven by the idea of three pillars, they're called, of legitimation, repression, and co-option. The ideas of the Arab Spring, if you would like to call it a monolithic entity, which of course it was not, but you saw public protests, you saw upsets to the state of affairs within countries, but also at that international level. You saw that the Obama administration was catastrophic for U.S. Gulf relations, and it was there was a huge turning point in which economic issues, social issues, foreign policy, they all combined to severely destabilize already fragile dynamics. And absolutely, that does play in to the book. That is the context of the time. But the secondary consequences in which we see the rise of MBZ, his brothers, his kin, and the persons around him, they expertly exploited this time, that perceived insecurity, to further build upon the foundations which they had started over 10, 15 years previous. That it accelerated that drive for security consolidation. It supported the enhancement of surveillance capabilities. You saw a great emphasis on economic expansion. And then we saw it again from industrial capabilities. Now, what I don't highlight is maybe that micro approach. So say, for example, immediately after the Arab Spring, as a way to co-opt the population, very broadly speaking, the steep increase in state salaries.
Right.
As an example.
Right.
Instead of looking at maybe those broader aspects, I look at elite control. So it's very top-down, but from a micromanaged approach, that it's those direct relationships, or as it's referred to, the agency chain. Right. How to ensure that direct control and oversight over affairs as much as possible. And so this is when you start seeing that the manager is a close ally with similar professional experience. And you start seeing these very prominent networks appear, which can have a magnifying effect over a much broader area. Right.
I mean, that's a very sort of important point, that you are looking at elite actors and elite politics, elite maneuvering in many respects, and the consolidation of power, economic power, military strengthening. I mean, these elites are, of course, state elites, so they have the ability the legitimate ability to develop military capacity, intelligence, surveillance, and all of those sorts of things. But the other point that you mentioned just now, which is really fascinating, is sort of the way in which citizens are co-opted. I mean, that's a term you used, not exactly in that particular context, but it's very easy to see this as kind of co-option. The same thing, after the Arab Spring, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia sort of immediately gave these handouts on a massive scale. And I just wonder if you think that do this is a kind of a moral question, so I don't, it's not really something that you address, but to what extent are citizens responsible for, the authoritarianism of these states?
I understand the question because of the lack of coherent response, because of the lack of differing response. The issue is it's something that I think as an outsider, it's very difficult to judge because also, whilst we can highlight the potential impact of, say, corruption, you then would also have to put into that equation the threat of repressive tactics.
Absolutely.
You then have, say, for example, if they, in the same way that the regime has little space for maneuverability, it's been shown throughout history in multiple different contexts within authoritarian states, the change in leadership and the shift in power doesn't often end peacefully.
Absolutely.
For a citizen of this country, of any of these countries really, it either takes and abides by those laws, or it's then out of that system.
Right.
And they then try and enhance the asabiya, those blood ties, those connections, that homogeneity.
Yeah.
But we've also seen the stripping of citizenship.
Right.
We see others going to, they become part of an exile community.
Right.
And others are obviously in prison and worse. The options aren't there. That there's no
absolutely.
third option, so to say.
I think that's a very sort of what can I say? It's a poignant but very real response to an impossible situation for a lot of people. And then you have, of course, these are countries where the vast majority of the population, I can't remember the statistic you quote, are not even citizens, right? And so for them, it's very easy just to say, okay, you're persona non grata in this country, you can leave now. And so you can silence a large section of the community. By default, they're silenced politically.
I actually, in the book, I don't even really focus on the ruling family's relationship with expats.
Right.
It's so, I argue that prominent threat is from their own national community.
Absolutely.
And so that's even more enhanced, that's even more stringent, that's even more focused. Exactly, because if you're one of the 91%, the terms and conditions for your residency are on an extremely short leash.
Absolutely, yes. So, I've been speaking to colleagues who work in the region. I try not to speak to them, people who are in some of the more sensitive countries too often, shall we say, because I don't want to get them in trouble. But yes, my understanding is rolling contracts are the main way in which expats are employed. So 1 year contracts at a time, so that they can be cut loose very quickly. At the same time, very often with considerable generosity, so they'll give you sort of very generous severance packages, so they can still attract some brilliant sort of talent. So it basically neutralizes the vast majority of the numbers there, which can help dilute the citizenry to a certain extent as well. But at the same time, I think this is also an indictment of the forms of citizenship that we've constructed in the 21st century, right? What does it mean? It's a bit rich coming from someone in Britain who lives as a subject, technically, but obviously the subjecthood that we have in Her Majesty's sort of United Kingdom has far more freedoms and latitude than is afforded by these states which were essentially in some respects set up by Her Majesty's government, right? In the 1970s.
We would like to think so. That may not always be the case.
Right.
But maybe it's what Rousseau refers to as the social contract.
Right.
That social contract is underpinned and is supported by vastly different terms and conditions.
Right.
Even though there are differences to it, and you'd have academic theories such as rentierism, which might suggest a complete co-option of society. This is obviously extremely inaccurate and very vague. That there's a lot more that goes into it.
Right.
But those social conditions and those relationships, they can be a weakness as well as a strength.
Right,
Um,
right.
and
Yeah, and I've commented on this channel several times in the past with previous authors how it's also the case that those freedoms are very unequally distributed depending on one's intersectional location in society. So I don't want to idealize our own condition as well. So I guess I'm going to take the opportunity now and thank you very much for all of the questions that are coming in. We will address them, and thankfully we have another hour to deal with these. I really appreciate it from everyone. I wanted to come to the religious question. So I work on in some respects, religious actors both at state level, but also at a popular level who are trying to foment sort of religiously grounded, accountable governance and things like this. One of the chief actors in my recent book is someone called Yusuf al-Qaradawi, very well known and, of course, like a banned sort of person in the UAE generally, although he was awarded the Dubai Quran Prize in 2000 by the Emir of Dubai. So, I mean, these allegiances shift dramatically over time, of course. So he was seen as like a very respected figure back in the day. So I wanted to ask, what's your impression of the way in which the state deploys religion? I mean, a moment ago you kind of said that the ideological establishment and religious establishment are sometimes a bit difficult to distinguish from each other. And I just want to highlight Abdullah bin Bayya is someone who left being the vice president to Yusuf Qaradawi at a Qatar-based International Union of Muslim Scholars. And he was, over the course of the early 2010s, so from 2012, 2013 onwards. So in 2013, he resigns from Qatar, and in 2014, he sets up the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, a project which on its website, it says the patron is Abdullah bin Zayed, right? So it's very clearly portrayed as a foreign ministry project. Mm-hmm. And Abdullah bin Bayya seems to be quite proud of that I'm actually a co-opted scholar of the government, and now he's the Emirates Fatwa Council chair. So he's effectively the Grand Mufti of Dubai. He's signed off on normalization with Palestine. He signed off on everything that the UAE does, basically. He recently came out in 2020 calling the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, which, of course, the UAE had done years ago. But that brings the religious establishment fully in line with state policy. I'd be interested to sort of know if you've had any opportunities to explore that dimension of the UAE.
So, we had actually worked on some projects with the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs, working alongside the opening of Hidayah, the Countering Violent Extremism Center.
Right. Right. Nice
and
name.
So, yeah.
Guidance, it means, literally.
So this was part of the soft counterterrorism angle that they were trying to promote.
Right.
And this was done with the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which I think it's Italy and Egypt are now trying to co-chair. So you get an understanding of an understanding of the drivers of this.
Right.
For countries like the UAE, especially the UAE, where they do have a monopolization on that religious doctrine, at least domestically.
Right.
They have very firmly promoted, as we've said, that quietist approach that is socially conservative. It's a socially conservative principle that rests upon many of those tenets, which also support that of a monarch. Mm-hmm. It's a certain strength, unity, obedience. And then you see this in practical institutions. The fact that the security services have such a strong role within society is perceived, that the state is the central provider is used in discourse such as the father of the state, the mother of the nation. It's all part of those, that traditional discourse that affirms Singularity.
Yeah. I mean, just basically hands over or gives carte blanche to the ruling authorities in the way that you've suggested. And although the term traditional I would hesitate to use, in the sense that so I'm thinking now in sort of philosophy and moral philosophy from the last 30 years, not 300 years. So Alistair McIntyre famously sort of wrote in a work called After Virtue in the 1980s on the notion of tradition, and that and in a later work again in the 1980s he basically said that we all operate within traditions. So liberalism is a tradition in the same way that. So I think in that, and so in some respects it's kind of like been a corrective to a certain type of modernization theory that suggests that we're departing from tradition. We fashion new traditions, of course, in important ways, but on the quietism point, and this is a point which I make in my book as well. This is where I think that there's something to be gained from looking at more thickly described sort of religious discourses, because there's a fantastic book by a legal scholar in the US called Khalid Abul Fadl. The book's called Rebellion and Violence in Islamic Law, and the notion that the tradition calls for obedience and quietism and all of these sorts of things is actually a construction of this generation of scholars, meaning not Western scholars, but this people like Abdullah bin Bayyah have created this as a narrative and tried to cement this kind of absolute fealty to the state. And he's actually, I mean, one of the arguments that I make in a very short form in this book, and I need to elaborate elsewhere, and I think it could be, disagreed with, is that Abdullah bin Bayyah is actually unprecedented in making the argument that the ruler can basically be given carte blanche in the name of the Sharia to disregard the Sharia, right? Which and it's a kind of self-defeating discourse, but it's very useful for the Grand Mufti of the country to say that, right? And so, I think that there's something which is quite powerful in the use of traditional discourses, so to speak, to subvert. And that's where people like Qaradawi are so threatening and need to be sort of banned and attacked in the mainstream discourse.
We've seen, as part of just to go full circle, we've then seen how, so we're speaking very much about internal dimensions and that ability to dominate the state.
Right.
But we have seen this tactic, and we've seen the tools used as part of that foreign policy project.
Right.
And so you then see the relationship with Hidayah as an example, with the Tabah Foundation, as a way of trying to subvert is maybe a strong word.
Yeah.
Trying to maybe monopolize that doctrine and narrative through other organizations, so that it's not simply a narrative and doctrine promoted by Abu Dhabi, but one that is then present in Chechnya. It's present in South Yemen. It's trying to reinterpret Deobandi ideology within India, in Indonesia.
Right.
But all in the name, and the way it's legitimized to the international arena is the legitimation away from corruptive political practices.
Right.
It's trying to turn it away, so that to say, the Muslim Brotherhood is the initial starting drug on the path to extremism, right?
Right. It's a gateway
drug. Absolutely. That's the way it's proposed.
Yeah.
And it's then to turn around and say, well, actually, we're trying to show tolerance. Right. We're showing strength and unity and stability.
Ministry of Tolerance, right? I mean, and the year 2020, I think, was the year of tolerance or something like that. Yeah.
2019, maybe. Yeah.
2019, yeah. Sorry. Yeah. And so, I mean, this is really interesting, and this kind of ties in with a lot of what I'm looking at. So the Taba Foundation, which you just mentioned, which is headed up, I think, still by a chap who's from Yemen. So Ali al-Jifri. I mean, he actually plays a small role in my book as well. But this kind of globalized network now, you're talking about South Yemen. So I assume that's linked to Tarim and the network that is connected to Ali al-Jifri.
And that was kicked out of Sada.
Kicked out of where, sorry?
Sada in northern Yemen by the Houthis.
Right. So I haven't, I'm not very well informed of the kind of Yemeni situation, unfortunately, but I didn't realize that the Houthis had confronted the. I mean, my impression was because Yemen is this kind of diverse state with various orientations. I mean, Ali al-Jifri in the past has made comments where he's saying, look, we don't have problems with the Shia, and the Zaydis are our brothers and things like that. But I assume if the political winds have changed, he'll have to change his tune as well somewhat. And so I'm just sort of wondering if you can tell me a little bit about what sort of things you've seen from Taba in particular. And I'd recommend a colleague of mine who, I mean, her dissertation is not publicly available, but she's actually studied a bit of Ali al-Jifri's work as well. I'll send you the details. Wala al-Quwaisi. I'll send you details later.
Thank you. It's only speaking very broadly, and it's just that, as I said, it's kind of repeating it, but it's trying to lead a counterexample to political elements of Islamic practice.
Right.
It's trying to show a third or fourth way that isn't proposed, that isn't politically charged as it may be seen in Iran, in Turkey, in parts of the conservative elements within Saudi Arabia and the Gulf.
Right.
It's trying to show a way that kind of suits all parties.
Yeah.
As just reinforcing what we've said before, it helps appease some of those conservative values.
Yeah.
But it also helps and provide a path for political legitimacy and authority.
In addition to that, there's another dimension to this, which is that in some respects, it is the hiving off of religion from the state. And so it appeals to a Western audience as well, because it sounds very secular. This is why, Bro Tabor, as he's known, Yusuf al-Tabor, the sort of ambassador in DC from the UAE, and one of the most effective ambassadors, as far as I can tell, in DC, has commented. He commented on Charlie Rose, of course, a couple of years ago, talking about what we want are strong, stable, secular states, and it caused a bit of a stir in the region, as far as I recall. But he can say that to a certain extent, because that is what they're asking for, is that the religious establishment becomes a rubber stamp to their activities.
It's not about removing religion. It's not about removing the religious identity, not in the slightest. This might even actually, globally speaking, there is there's actually an adoption towards religiosity in many different ways. There is a strong audience for that. It doesn't matter what the faith is. But if you have those values that underpin your society, that message is taken on board by many states nowadays.
So this is actually there's important theoretical work on this as well. I mean, you will be familiar with Peter Mandeville's work, I assume, on sort of he has a fantastic textbook on Islam and politics, and by the time he got to the third edition, he'd renamed from Global Political Islam, I think, to Islam and Politics. And part of the reason for that is he was saying that there's a presupposition brought out by sort of post-colonial theorists that religion and politics are supposed to be distinct from each other. But that's, an artifact of modernist kind of interpretations of these sorts of things. Whereas, those sorts of distinctions are not universalizable. Now, I mean, I think this is a very valuable insight. It's one I share as a would-be post-colonial theorist myself, but in the sense that within the Islamic tradition, that conception of religion as being distinct from politics is not native, right? It's something which develops basically after the 17th century in Europe, and it's taken global. But ironically, at that point, when Europe's changed its conception of what religion is, and imposed it globally, it's like every other instance where religion has remained in its, pre-modern form is seen as some kind of aberration. And so there is a kind of, this kind of religion that they're generating is, I think, one which is very well adapted to a kind of secular authoritarianism. But the Islamists in the region are also, I think, they have a PR task ahead of them, but they are advocating for democracy in the name of their religious values as well. And so I think that there is a potential or a possibility of using religion in that sort of way that is subversive to these states. But at the same time, because it's appealing to a democratic governance, it could potentially be appealing to Western policymakers as well. Potentially. I mean, the problem with democracy is in the region is that the West thinks it always goes against its interests, and for very understandable reasons, of course, because the West's interests are very often antithetical to the democratic interests of the people in the region, unfortunately. Yeah. I wonder if we should now, we've been, our audience members have been very patient with us and they've been sticking around with us all this time. Actually, it's a couple of people, so we have a lot of questions from our regular audience member, Black Viper. So I'll take some of his, but there are a couple of others as well. If you just give me one moment, I'm going to try and share this on the screen. So Black Viper says, aren't the UAE more dependent on mercenary forces? Remember hearing it somewhere. And what prevents something akin to a military coup like those seen in the 1900s? Okay, it's a good question.
There are. The UK the UAE has slowly transitioned away from a dependence on foreign soldiers.
Okay.
There were the leaked stories about mercenary troops being employed to help act as a counterforce to a potential civilian uprising.
Right.
And what was quite interestingly noted and perfect for our discussion is the fact that they wanted non-Muslim soldiers because they didn't want them to hesitate about firing on the predominantly Muslim population.
Right, of course.
Now, in terms of defending against coups, this is something which I do actually go into in quite a lot of detail in the book.
Right.
And there's the physical manifestation of, in the past, military support and control was always the predominant issue.
Right.
So they had the military close to their palaces and so forth. But over time, they have grown to see the military as a threat. And so Abu Dhabi is an island. And they have now removed all of the military bases except for, it's called like a Praetorian Guard unit. So that is primarily designed to protect the regime.
Right.
And that's called the Presidential Guard.
Right.
There's only those units, the headquarters of the military and an airfield. Everything else is then physically away from the city.
Fascinating.
And instead what they then do is they then refer to local domestic security agencies such as the Mukhabarat, in this case the State Security Department, who would then go and target civil persons instead of a tangible physical manifesting threat in the guise of a military or a significant entity. State security can target individuals, groups, cells, and go after them to nullify a threat.
Right. But one of the things which is particularly interesting about the UAE context that you highlight in the Al Nahyan context is how many of the threats have traditionally come from other family members, right? And I mean, you paint this somewhat frightening portrait, in my view, of MBZ's consolidation of power. So he's obviously head of the security forces in all their various guises, as far as I understand. His son, Sultan or Khalifa? Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed is now being groomed as his successor, which, I mean, to my mind, it's like, wait, what will his brothers do about that? Have they been, tamed and domesticated to that degree? Because some of them are very talented, of course, but his son's being groomed, and so in a sense, like, the military threat in the UAE context isn't as salient as it has been in many Arab countries in the region. So I wonder Yeah, if you could comment briefly on that as
Sure.
well.
So the UAE Armed Forces, again, that's being used to socialize the population, so to say.
Right.
They have the Abu Dhabi ruling family. Of course, Mohammed bin Zayed was the chief of staff, the head of the Air Force, and
Right.
as you've said from the book, he's then brought up a lot of his peers from his time with him into civilian positions.
Right.
As a way to fuse the wider civilian population, both nationals and non-nationals, to the UAE Armed Forces and their mission.
Right.
There are these social elements such as, Remembrance Day, like we have in the UK, and then many countries have it. And so following a large number of deaths from Yemen, they have started to use it as a unifying force. You then see national service for Emirati nationals. It's a way of then binding the native population to this entity, which is first and foremost, the protector of the state. Right. It's a way of absolutely fusing that bond to ensure that that the two are always together, that you can't separate them. Right. In a way, it's a process to actually potentially take away the threat by making it part of the same image.
Right.
But when you then consider the federal element, where historically at least the different emirates were not part of the same state, and they all had different threat perceptions, by rewriting that social contract and changing the unity, the identity from one of an emirate level to a national level, you can severely undermine how people interact, with their political entities. What does that then mean if they are from Ras Al Khaimah, Fujairah, or Sharjah, and all of a sudden you are spending your entire time in Abu Dhabi in the military, which is based and housed in Abu Dhabi?
Right.
What's your dynamic? What's your relationship with the Emir of Abu Dhabi versus that of the nation, or that in Sharjah and so forth? Those traditional ties can be undermined in another way, maybe deliberately to strengthen and to off-balance other relationships.
Right. No, I mean, the way you portray Abu Dhabi's kind of commanding presence in the entire emirate. Dubai is the only other that has kind of a bit of an international profile. Historically, it's been more salient, but Abu Dhabi is really they've got everything as far as I can tell. I mean, they've taken over everything, and it does make sense for them to try and attenuate the relations of various federal citizens to their local states, and somehow attach them to the Abu Dhabi.
Going to the idea of succession, there's also a very interesting point where Mohammed bin Zayed and maybe the elder generation were more present in those traditional entities, such as the military. His brothers, they are now part of that elite leadership that is running the country in every single guise.
Right.
His number two predominantly is Sheikh Tahnoon, as well as Sheikh Hazar. But those two, again, have intelligence and security backgrounds.
Right.
As the National Security Advisor, Deputy National Security Advisor, but now Khalid, Mohammed bin Zayed's son, works directly with Tahnoon as the Deputy National Security Advisor.
Right.
Instead of going the route through the military, that they are exploiting that internal security apparatus and mechanism for upward mobility.
Right.
And that's because the delicate nature of it means they would only hire from certain tribes, from certain families. It's not something available to the entire population. It's a secret entity.
Right.
But this is where MBZ is building his succession through to ensure that long-term development.
You call this, this is the SIA, Signals?
So the SIA, the Signals Intelligence Agency, is the surveillance entity within state security.
Right, right, okay.
Yeah,
But you're talking about the broader entity within which
correct, correct,
SIA
correct.
sits. And so Tahnun, and now the deputy is
Khalid.
Khalid. Yes, I mean, yeah, MBZ, as David Kirkpatrick put it, and I don't know if you cited him at any point, but he said the most powerful ruler in the Middle East is not MBS, it's MBZ. We've all sort of heard stories of notorious stories of MBS, obviously because of his like bungling exploits in other parts of the country, and to the south, in other parts of the region, whether in south or in Turkey. But MBZ is, I think, just far more formidable a player in the region. He's far more of a Machiavellian prince in that sense, although he's presiding over a far smaller sort of entity. As far as I understand, however, and you do cite this, as I recall, the UAE has had the most astronomical growth in its army and air force and all of these sorts of things. The expenditures that they put out, the establishment of bases in various parts of the Horn of Africa and so on. It, to my mind, seems to have outstripped Saudi Arabian activity in the region as well. I don't know in terms of purchasing scale, because Saudi Arabia obviously is a larger country and will have a larger army. But I wonder if you could briefly comment on that. And I do promise viewers that we will come back to your questions in a moment. Right.
So MBZ, you have to remember, he is old enough to be MBS's father.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
So he's older. He's had more statehood. He as the third son of Sheikh Zayed, he actually wasn't thrust into political power like his elder two brothers. So he engaged with things in a much more practical sense.
Yeah.
He's had time to assess and to work through different aspects. Going to the military development again, when we earlier spoke of religious doctrine and as a way to assert themselves domestically and regionally, following 9/11, the UAE was you had a fairly negative perception in the US when they were denied access to certain weapons.
Right.
So since then, they have been a prominent supporter and motivator behind security-related issues across the region. And MBZ, as a previous military figure, as we've said in the book and elsewhere, he's brought these persons up with him. They are trusted, they will do their job, they are apolitical, but they also have that direct relationship and engagement with MBZ.
Right.
And so when we see the UAE armed forces, they can be seen as a way to enforce security. Right. They're involved in NATO in Afghanistan.
Right.
They're involved in Bosnia. They're involved in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria. But also they have a role domestically in terms of driving perceived modernization as part of an engager within the military. Within the field of education.
Huh, okay.
To have pilots, say, you would need to have engineers. For both of those, you would need to have persons who are educated to a good degree.
Right, right.
And so this then drives other areas within the state.
Right. It's a technocracy in a sense. It's about developing skill sets. Yeah. Through military focus.
We have a saying in England. It's like different ways to skin a cat, right? I don't know why we have it, but we do. It's of course the development of the military can be different to different people, of course.
Right.
But it doesn't deny the fact that it has acted as a driver of economic industrialization. It has helped spur on education fields. But obviously it is part of that securitization domestically and internationally, and helps provide MBZ with a greater platform from which to drive on.
It also ties him to the Pentagon very strongly. And I wonder what that does to these, alternative relations that they are trying to develop with China. And also, the Emirates as a whole, and Dubai in particular, I think, have a very, delicate balancing act in their relation with Iran as well. I mean, how they manage all of these different sort of relationships with Israel. They have, perhaps the closest relationship with Israel of any Arab country, bar Egypt, perhaps,
Or Jordan.
and Jordan, of course, yeah. And I wonder, sort of, I mean, to a certain extent, there's a case to be made that Egypt and Jordan were thrust into this relationship, but the UAE has voluntarily entered it to, in some respects, ingratiate DC and Washington. And also
the way they've
tap
done
into-
that
Yeah,
is by showing when we go back to, we're speaking about the year of tolerance.
right.
It's a way that they self-orientalize themselves by saying that actually we are modern people. We have gone beyond this issue. We're so forward thinking that, and it's a way of depoliticizing a very political issue by streamlining that dynamic.
Right.
It doesn't mean there aren't reservations.
Yeah,
It just means it's an easy way to advertise and illustrate the direction they've taken.
but again, given the nature of the authoritarian society, those reservations are suppressed, right? In wider society, the reservations will have to be suppressed, at great risk to those who will not do that. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to. So this is a fairly general question from the amusingly named Hom Tanks. He asks, who was or is the biggest loser after the Arab Spring? And I guess this is like an opportunity for you to sort of just spread your wings a little and think a bit broadly, if you like.
I would argue that there hasn't really been an out-and-out, quote, winner in the Arab Spring. Everyone's kind of lost. And that sounds like a horrendous thing to say, that this is a perfect argument to justify the stability of authoritarian regimes and monarchs.
Right.
Do you give credit to the fact that do you try and is it negative? Is it a way of looking down on people and saying, well, at least they tried to be politically free, right? You say, oh, better luck next time,
Right.
or is it the fact that they have tried to develop a political practice but have either not been supported or have been defeated by that authoritarian resilience.
Right.
It has weakened all of these states, and it has brought to the attention the delicate social contracts that exist, but there has not been solid development of social political issues in any country.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is about these kinds of grand historical sort of events, if we can call them that, is that we'll be reflecting on them for decades, right? And they'll be playing out for decades, which is why it requires that kind of. I'm a perpetual optimist, so to speak, and I also I'm a believer who thinks about things in a slightly different sort of to the conventional assessment of winning and losing. So, people may have died, but people, as it were martyred, so to speak. So, their rewards are to come in some respects. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting phrasing of the question: who is the biggest loser, not who's the biggest winner, right? And I think our friend Hom Tanks is probably onto something when he's using loser rather than winner, because it's very difficult, as you say, to see any sort of meaningful winners at this stage. I'm going to shift to another question. Black Viper, I will come to your comments in a moment. I want to just, while we've got a bit of time for questions, I'm going to take one of your questions. So I think this is one set of questions, so I'm going to read it out. Do you believe the UAE's high concentration of expats also meant protests were not seen during the Arab Spring in terms of the religious makeup of the UAE? Oh, I think that's a separate question. So
my question, my response would be, if you'd ask them what would be the purpose of those protests in the Arab Spring? Is the protests against the local authority for different reasons?
Right.
If it's the expat population in the UAE and the Gulf, they have no legitimate call for reform. They have no legitimate call for greater support. They are there as an expat, as a visitor.
Yeah.
So in that sense, the fact that, if you're going to follow that chain of thought,
Yeah.
the fact that there's such a high percentage of foreign population,
Yeah.
unless they were to organize under a different guise, be it an overthrow of the ruling family,
Right.
there is what other how else would they organize? For what purpose?
Right. But even
Because
there, if you'll forgive the interruption, like if they were to organize, they're basically a foreign entity trying to overthrow them. Like it's
correct.
yeah.
And it becomes then is it a fine line of you want to call for a demand? Absolutely, you can find a way to do so.
Yeah.
But to centrally organize and to exercise that protest, you're then going, you're polarizing these communities, these political thoughts, and it very quickly, you don't have any ground to stand on, and they will just be simply expelled.
So this is another interesting dimension of this, and we can think back at the way in which you had large-scale immigration in the 1950s, 60s, and like post-war in Europe, in Germany, Gastarbeiter, so guest workers, and in places like the UK, so my parents' generation, for example, and I'm just thinking that, my father mentions this to me, has mentioned this to me in the past. Like when he came and he was a student in the 1970s, and then he got married to my mum in the late 70s, and after the marriage, he just sent off some paperwork to the Home Office, and I think they sent her a residency permit like immediately in the mail to Bangladesh, right? And so automatically she's being given the rights to vote. She's being given the right. So, this is an indictment of the conception of citizenship also that operates in that part of the world, which is very deliberate and calculated to disenfranchise 90% of the population, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's why they can use the conceptual tools that citizenship offers in perverse ways to say that, well, we'll just expel you. You're foreigners. You're going to be engaged in an intervention on the part of a foreign sort of entity.
But that how different is that, from what happens here in the UK, or the recent laws that the Home Office passed, the citizenship laws.
Yeah.
That's not too far off.
It's not at all. But I mean, yeah, in our case, basically the war on terror is creating a kind of like quasi-authoritarian reality for people of a particular skin color or people of a particular immigrant sort of background. If you've got two passports or have the possibility of holding two passports, I mean, that's what the law says right now. Something like 5 or 6 million Brits are like that. And, it's a reminder that, okay, a person like myself whose parents were born in a different country, I need to stay in line. Otherwise, thankfully, like it's not as bad as if I was in the UAE right now, I wouldn't be able to make this comment, right, in a public forum. But just because there's a worse comparator out there doesn't mean that what we have is wrong as well, right? So yeah, it's not we're not in a great situation for sort of thinking about democracy and freedom in the world at the moment. As a perpetual optimist, I think there's no place to go but up. But obviously we can get worse circumstances. But I think that it's important to hold to this kind of Gramscian sentiment of having pessimism of the intellect, as we've expressed, but optimism of the will. So I want to. So someone called G Saki asks, and thank you all for the questions. These are really sort of helping us go places we weren't necessarily expecting. So why do Saudi Arabia and the UAE have the same goals? All because of the Shia expansion, or is the biggest threat for that region the followers of the deen, meaning of the religion? So I guess we could question whether they do have the same goal, but I guess Shiism is an important thing that we've not touched on actually here.
So I'm not sure if they have exactly as you said. Do they have the same goals in the same way? Does England and Scotland have the same goals? Right. There are different perceptions.
Right.
There are different beliefs. There are different motivations. They may share them, but for completely different reasons. They may share them for the same reasons.
Right.
I think it would be unfair to say that either are Saudi Arabia and the UAE that both would like to see a conservative Islamic form of monarchy, across the region. As a principle, that they would not like that to change.
Yeah, yeah.
Political Islam to them, either if they truly believe it or if it's something that suits their political status, is one that, as we've said, is the gateway drug to violent extremism. They see it as non-violent extremism that can help push people into the path of different organizations.
That's a narrative that comes straight out of the war on terror, of course.
Correct, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this obviously, as we've seen, this has changed from the 80s, sending the Arab Mujahideen to Afghanistan and so forth in the space of a decade or so.
Right.
That's very quickly changed, and that's then been widened and enabled to help strengthen wider communities.
Right.
The issue of the sectarian identity aspect is as much to do with the social dynamics as it is about the ideological belief. It's as much to do with the fact that there is a perception that the Shia community in Saudi Arabia, mainly based around Dammam and the east, are seen as an other. They're seen as an other foreign population.
Yeah.
You then see in the Emirates, the Aimi community who have historical roots to Iran are seen as a foreign element by comparison to the Bedouin communities from the south and from the desert.
Right.
It's as much to do with that aspect as it is anything else.
But I suspect, the Shia community. So Saudi Arabia is a little bit different because of the history of kind of the Wahhabi state,
Correct.
which in its first and second guises was even more intolerant in a sense to non-conformist or non-Wahhabi Islamic denominations. So and the Shia were sort of like even worse than the non-Wahhabi Sunnis, of course. But so Saudi Arabia has a very distinctive kind of issue. But 1979, of course, changed things in a very dramatic way in the political realm as well. And now these entities are potential threats in the same way that Western countries have at times kind of tarred Muslim members of the population with the same. They've tarred them with the same brush. And so that sort of the potency of religion in the political realm when it comes to Islam is, some people don't like putting it this way. So Michael Cook, one of my committee members, he wrote a book called Ancient Religions, Modern Politics. And a lot of people complained that he was, in some respects, essentializing Islam as a political religion of some kind. But I actually, as someone who is Muslim myself, I see it in a slightly different way, which is that, I embrace a understanding of Islam which recognizes that the political realm also has, Islam has things to say about the ethics of public life, and so that bleeds into the political realm inevitably. And so, I don't think one needs to essentialize about Islam to be able to say that actually there is a political dimension to our ethical sensibilities that is informed by our Islamic understanding of things.
I'll put when we have the aspect of that political identity.
Yeah.
You have to remember, in the same way that the UAE and Saudi Arabia have tried to proselytize their own interpretations and versions of Islam.
Right.
That's also in contrast and in opposition to that being seen by Iran trying to monopolize Shia thought.
Right.
Away from the centers in Iraq. They're trying to ensure that it stays centrally located in Qom and elsewhere.
Right.
The lack of Arab Shia scholars has now basically ensured that it is totally fixed on an Iran post 1979. And so what happens is then any members of that community are then deemed a security threat. So you'll see national expulsions of persons across the Gulf.
Right.
And you'll see them targeting Lebanese Shia communities, Iraqi Shia communities, and Afghani Shia communities, because there's a belief that they hold a security threat, an internal security threat.
Right, right. And I mean, which is all the more tragic in some respects because by the Islamic Republic creates a kind of impression of ideological uniformity where Shia Islam has been historically very diverse in these sorts of, so I believe Sistani, for example, in Iraq, is a dissenter from Khomeini's conception of, wilayat al-faqih, or the guardianship of the jurist. And but now, because of the threat of Iran, every sort of Iranian is seen as somehow potentially infected by that kind of ideology.
Fadlallah and Sistani were the last, some of the last figures
Holdouts, right?
in that independent thought, which has now seemingly disappeared.
Right, right. Well, states are extremely difficult to combat, aren't they? Right. We're getting lots of hellos and salamu alaikum from Adam Z saying I'm from Oman. Very kind of you. Wa alaikum salam. Someone's asking, actually, speaking of Oman, and this is, of course, within the broad region, why is Oman different to other Gulf countries concerning sectarianism or accommodating minorities in their country?
So there's a degree of there's a difference in the homogeneity, the historical past that it has, the context of which Oman is built upon. The huge connections with East Africa, with the Indian subcontinent,
right?
With the history of Portugal, the Dutch, the British, their relationship with Yemen,
right?
With the northern communities, they aren't as homogenized and dominated by single tribes as it may be in parts of the UAE or in Qatar or Kuwait and so forth. There's a different mix, so to say. In regards to accommodating minorities, it can be seen as maybe a reaction to a different political economy basis of say rentierism. Again, rentierism is a lazy way of trying to discuss the social contract,
right?
But it can fit where they are not, the citizens are not as dependent upon the state for their quote handouts.
Right.
There's a livelier political social life within Oman,
right?
And so part of that, there's this old community of minorities of Indians, Iranians, and so forth that have always come through the country.
Right.
They are part of the heritage, and so yeah.
So
it's
in a sense,
Oman
doesn't suffer the oil curse quite as much because they don't have as much of it, and so they don't have the opportunity to make such a striking distinction between citizens and non-citizens, perhaps as a consequence. I don't know.
They give citizenship to many Yemenis from Mahra.
Right.
Who live on the border with Oman
right.
because of certain shared history and connection.
Sure. And also presumably because the citizens aren't a significant cost to the state in the way in which they would be in other parts. I mean, yeah, I guess being a citizen is really a perk in some of these petromonarchies where you get massive handouts, and it's like, why would I rebel against this?
Several of the Gulf countries have they obviously have their embassy, but they would have a second building of some kind on Harley Street, which is a street in London for private medical facilities.
Right.
The nationals going there are then advised as to where to go by members of their embassy. And often it's paid by the state as well.
Right. Wow. I mean, that's incredible. So, I mean, like for people who are maybe not familiar with London's Harley Street, it's probably one of the world's most expensive places to get private healthcare and dental work and so on. So I was not aware of that. We have too many questions really to do justice to. If it's all right, I'm going to cycle back to a question from Black Viper. Okay. So he asks, in terms of the religious makeup of the UAE, I always assumed that the UAE was more Salafi inclined. So why have the UAE opted for bin Bayyah, who is more Sufi inclined? It's an interesting question. So
I'm gonna bounce it back to you.
oh, okay.
Because this is not my that theoretical engagement. Is something I can't expertly comment on.
That's fine. I mean, I'm going to, and I might sort of rely on elements of what you're familiar with, but my understanding is that so Salafi is, of course, a term which in academia very often we'll use Wahhabi instead in the Gulf region, but it's not the case that I'm aware. As far as I'm aware, the UAE is not Salafi, and it's one of the things which they take kind of a pride in not being Salafi, and they've sometimes attacked extremism as coming out of like Wahhabism and things like that. So that's why it does make a good deal of sense for someone like bin Bayyah, who is Sufi inclined. Bin Bayyah is very interesting because he lives in Saudi Arabia. He's reportedly, through the grapevine, I've heard he's been granted UAE citizenship, and he has a home in Abu Dhabi as well. As of 2014 probably, but he's between those two countries, and yes, he is a Sufi sheikh as well, and I think that it makes a good deal of sense in that sort of context. So I wanted to. So there are so many comments. Let me see if I can pick another one out. So there's a question which relates to, again, I hope it's not sort of too far out from what you're doing, but it seems it's a relevant reference to something you said. In terms of states such as Chechnya and Indonesia, I understand how the narrative is being used, but could you expand on the Deoband comment? This is actually interesting to me as well, as I assumed they weren't state affiliated other than like Darul Uloom Karachi and Pakistan. So Deoband has, of course, sort of Pakistan branches, but India is where the original Deoband madrasa is.
So this is as much about the foreign policy as it is about domestic policy. So
Right.
whilst with Chechen and Indonesia, there are, you're not going to have a huge Chechen diaspora anywhere. Maybe Kazakhstan is the only place where you would find a sizable Chechen population, or maybe Turkey, but you're not going to have that same engagement. Whereas the Indian Pakistani population across the Gulf, and the footprints that they have is huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so if you consider the assumption that, from Abu Dhabi's perspective, that Deobandism is wrong, it is ultra conservative, it is a different perception. They want to try and turn people's attention away from it.
Mm-hmm.
The direct consequence is that it may also help stabilize their ability to manage those populations at home.
Right.
It then also helps when you look at their growing relationship with India, with Pakistan, as a tool of foreign policy, as a way to say, well, actually, we're going to help you out. We're going to help you manage your Indian population within India.
Right.
We're going to tone down some of their rhetoric if you promise to do the same. And it becomes, as a way of counter-terrorism ideology and counter-terrorism practice, can attune to the West as part of a security guarantee. That discourse can also play part to persons in the East, in India, in Pakistan, in China, as a way to depoliticize some of those quite fragile communities.
So, I mean, if I can add here, and I'm not particularly familiar with exactly how Deoband has been, or that maybe there have been attempts by the Indian state to, discipline and punish perhaps Deoband as. So Deoband is like the largest madrasa ideology, as well as being an actual Darul Uloom, or an actual center for higher learning in the UP in India, Uttar Pradesh. It's also got branch campuses, as it were, people that are inspired by that perspective of Islam, a kind of Hanafi, it's a Hanafi Maturidi sort of, and Sufi incidentally as well, kind of Islamic ideology, for want of a better expression. Yet at the same time, in the West, it's very often understood in the connection with Taliban, for example, and in connection with kind of jihadism. So this is one of the places which disrupts the understanding that Sufism is necessarily non-violent as well. And so I suspect that, the Indian state under Modi would have tried to put its foot down against an institution like Deoband from getting political in the slightest. So my impression is, as someone who's not a close observer, that a lot of Indian Islamic clerics have emphasized quietism and just staying out of trouble. And that works very well, actually, with, and potentially, as you seem to suggest, that some of that influence may be coming from places like Abu Dhabi.
So they've been training, they're increasingly training Indian imams,
right,
as a way to try and subvert that ideology, to try and reverse it.
Good grief. So
yeah.
Yeah, never let an opportunity go to waste, I suppose.
And you can see the complete mirroring between the relationship between Abu Dhabi and New Delhi. You can see these connections where it goes hand in hand with economic aspects.
Right.
In the same way that for Abu Dhabi it might push hard on the counterterrorism aspect with the US to get weapons and economic benefits. It will do the same with India and China, for others.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I guess this is really about the state's security, longevity, economic power, and even if that's at the cost of, for example, Muslims in annexed Kashmir at this point,
because that's a political issue.
Right.
And that exactly what we've been saying. It's the dissection between the two.
Right.
Religion is a personal issue, except it's heavily politicized.
Yeah.
But it's separate from state policy.
Yeah. So in some respects, this is the triumph of Europe and European modernization of religion as a category, so to speak. But if I have anything to say about it in my future works, I'll sort of explain why this is untenable. But that's hopefully something that we can contribute to. I mean, so that maybe this is a nice point to come towards a conclusion. And I apologize to Kashikatuka, so to speak, for your comment. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to it, but I wanted to ask you about the ethics of scholarship for a moment. So. I've been thinking about sort of the work that I do, and I've been an intellectual historian, but I'm actually now veering into moral philosophy and political theory because I think that I have very strong ethical views that I'd like to articulate systematically, so to speak. And I just sort of wonder, like, when we study these kinds of states, and you may have a very different perspective to me, and please feel free to express it. When we study these kinds of authoritarian regimes, to what extent should we be thinking about sort of the way in which we contribute to shining a light on problematic practices as well? And I think that's one of the things that your book contributes to.
I'm going to respond with a question, and it's not me trying to deliberately entrap you.
Sure.
Do you consider my book to be not normatively critical of the UAE? Look, beyond the academic aspect, is it normatively critical? Am I attacking it?
No. It's very much in the tradition of political science, right? It's a descriptive piece of empirical scholarship, as far as I can tell.
So when I respond to your comment about how do we then engage with that on a moral and ethical level,
right?
If we are maintaining and keeping the focus within the academic aspect, I would personally say it's about highlighting accurate information, being descriptive in that sense.
Yeah.
Because especially the Gulf states or authoritarian states this is their antithesis.
Right.
When you have pure evidence and information that cannot be contested, it's very hard to defend in that sense.
Right.
But if you come in a polemic approach, if you come in with a very vested angle, which it's not for me to criticize, for those purposes and reasons why.
Sure.
But if you do that, you provide a way out for those states.
Yeah.
You enable them to say, well, you're only saying this because you are X, Y, Z, because you're doing this and that.
Right.
And it does become hard to try and ensure that you take it seriously, but you need to be able to do that. You need to have a conscious approach that that really does encapsulate the whole piece, the whole agenda, the whole concept about how and why these things occur.
Right.
Because it's not, things aren't that simple.
Right.
There are benefits as well as positive, as there are benefits and weaknesses in every position. It's try and give some balance and critique yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, what I'd say to that is two things. One is that I think there's always a major challenge. So I, as a Muslim myself, and as also actually a Muslim theologian, so I'm doubly trained. I'm trained as an intellectual historian, but also trained as a sort of theologian. So for me, to engage in that ethical discourse, I can own it and say that, look, this is my tradition. That's what I do. Political theory, of course, has become very unpopular in sort of like academia overall, like in competition with political science. So this kind of empirical, often quantitative work is far more popular. I think partly because of the sorts of concerns that you've highlighted. And in addition to that, I think there are legitimate concerns to be sort of articulated about potential Orientalism in these kinds of engagements. If moral judgments are being directed from states which were previously colonial powers in the region, right? But I think, in my sort of context, I feel that I actually have a duty. I'm kind of a post-colonial myself, and I have a kind of ethical duty that is not just a function of my positionality within sort of Western academia, where I see myself as something of a subversive element, quote unquote, as a kind of decolonial theorist, so to speak.
How dare you?
How dare I? Well, I mean, thankfully, I couldn't talk quite so frankly like a couple of decades ago, and now decolonial theory is not sort of seen as kind of unwelcome necessarily. In fact, to a certain extent, this sort of stuff is like seen as somewhat cutting edge in some circles. And so yeah, I mean, like I think my own sort of distinct history and personal positionality allows for that in a way that I can understand that some people would just like to focus on the scholarship in a more empirical, descriptive manner rather than a normative manner. And I can entirely respect that perspective. So this has really been fantastic, Matthew, and I really wish we had more time, but I think you have to sort of, we both have teaching obligations and things like that to get back to, and I really appreciate you're writing the book. I would recommend, strongly recommend people interested in the UAE and its future to get your hands on this ridiculously well documented book. It's also because it's so well documented, the actual reading is not, I found it a nice easy read. It didn't, even though it looks very thick, it didn't read in that sort of intimidating way, shall we say. I found it very informative and very concise in many respects. So I suspect there'll be a discount code somewhere.
Yes, it's Hedges 25. But,
fantastic! I will post that on the description when I sort of, and please do stick around. I'm going to sort of conclude now, but I'll see you in the green room, so to speak. But thank you everyone for really engaging us with all your questions and comments. We do apologize that we didn't have the opportunity to go through all of them because of shortness of time, but I'm extremely grateful for your time, Matthew, and extremely grateful for all the participants with all their very thoughtful questions. And Matthew, if you want to say anything, please feel free. I didn't really give you an opportunity to say any closing comments. All right, fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been my honor and my pleasure. And for everyone else, I'll see you in less than a couple of weeks' time. So on Thursday, the 10th of February, I'll be inviting a friend and colleague from the Religious Freedom Institute in, I don't remember which state in the United States, Ismail Roya, to actually have an interesting conversation with me about my book. We have slightly different interpretations of what went on in the Middle East over the last decade, and that will be hopefully reflected in a nice kind of debate slash polite sort of mutual disagreement conversation in about 10 days' time. So please do join us then. But until then, fi amanillah, stay well, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.